It uses a ton of open source. If you go to like your settings, about legal notices, you'll see like pages and pages of open source software that your iPhone and Android device essentially depends on. Smart TVs in this room, same thing. I was messing around with my smart TV last night to just see like, oh my gosh, there's all this like open source stuff that ships within the TV. So it's just wild to see how things have kind of changed over the years. So today's panel will basically kind of focus on how open source has become pervasive and essentially how communities are being built within respective companies to kind of deal with essentially taking advantage of and contributing to open source. So kind of kick things off, I'll have our panelists introduce themselves before we kind of get into a little Q&A. So first, let's go, Josh. Or Conrad. We'll start on that side.
Yeah, so my name's Conrad. I was the first engineer at Uber. I started there in 2010. I kind of worked on a little bit of everything, building out our original prototype, keeping it running, dispatch systems, business layers, APIs, and I managed the analytics infrastructure team at one point. And I built a product management team in Amsterdam, so I kind of covered the whole gamut. I'm supposed to talk about my open source experience.
We'll get to that. We'll just don't worry. Let's do some brief intros first, and we'll get mic'd up properly. Yeah, go ahead, Maggie.
Hi everyone. My name is Maggie. I work on the global ecosystem team at Dell, and let me explain myself and my team. We work with our partner communities who are
Switch mics. Steve, see if that works. Or Conrad. Conrad's mic worked. Little technical difficulties.
Yeah, so I work with the partner communities, trying to get them successful with Cloud Foundry and other pivotal softwares and technologies, which are predominantly based on open source technologies. So that can mean developing integrations between our software and an independent software vendor, their technology, or sponsoring joint events for the community with our partners. And as far as open source background goes, I'm actually coming at this from a perspective of someone who's relatively new to the open source community and contributing back in a meaningful way. So I'm really excited to learn from the panelists.
Hi, my name is Steve DeRora. I'm currently over at GE Digital on the Predix Cloud engineering team. Relatively new there, about 9 months or so. Before that, I was on the Siri team at Apple, and I was there Siri pre-acquisition, so a lot of open source involvement. Considering I was the one DevOps guy. Fun thing about being at GE Digital right now, there's the concept of buy, borrow, and build. And with the team being as new as it is, there's definitely a lot of open source involvement. And we have strong partnerships with folks like EMC and Pivotal. So it's definitely been a challenge.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. Josh?
My name is Joshua Bernstein. I'm the Vice President of Technology at Dell EMC. Among one of my most passionate, responsibilities is I manage and run the code team for Dell EMC. We're responsible for all the developer advocacy and all of the open source work through Dell. And I'm pleased to have you all here. Prior to that, I worked with Steve actually at Apple on Siri. I was not with the original team, but we shared an office together, and I'm surprised we never killed each other. We closed a few times. That was at one time there was one caught, and then anyway. And then my background before that is in high performance computing, fluid dynamics, and materials engineering. And throughout my entire career, I think it's all been about open source. I don't think that I would have had a career without open source. I started when I was a student in college, and back in those days, you didn't have a resume, right? So how do you get real work? Well, I contributed a bunch of code to a project called Samba, and somebody noticed, and somebody offered me a job, and I guess the rest is history. So I'm pleased to be here, and I thank you all for coming out. Chris, are you good there? Are you getting mic'd up? You guys have any good jokes in the meantime? Talk for 5 more seconds.
Should be all good.
Should I tell you the story of the one caught?
No, it's all good. No, well, we're all good.
So real quickly, there's a picture that's been floating around, and the story goes that so I lived in the city at the time. This was when Conrad had just moved down.
Okay, cool.
And we actually did sleep in our offices. during launch. And I think I came into the office one morning and I was like, I'm exhausted. I'm going to go to this meeting, I'm going to take a nap. And Steve's like, oh, that's so funny. Nap is also on my calendar. And I think we kind of just like both looked at each other and like ran for the con. It didn't work out so well.
All right, perfect. And so,
Did you like that, Maggie? It's a true story of open source.
lovely. All these little technical.
Do you want this mic, Chris?
I think we're good? You hear me now or no? Maybe I'll just use them. Oh, I think we're good. My name is Chris Anizik. I've been heavily involved in open source for, almost 20 years now from, kind of the early days of, I started kind of my contribution to, if people remember, like FreeBSD, Slack, all those wonderful old school Linux distros, and eventually moved through different open source communities through my career from, the Clips. If people ever, wrote some Java back in their days, they probably have touched some Clips tooling that I've written. After that, had my own open source startup and eventually ended up starting and running Twitter's kind of open source program office and kind of infrastructure team. And then eventually ended up running something called the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is part of something called the Linux Foundation. So if you're familiar with Linux, it's an operating system, and there's kind of a non-for-profit behind it that kind of acts as a steward for all these different open source foundations out there, like Node.js and so on. So, to kind of get started, I'm going to go kind of pick Steve's brain a little bit. So, GE, when I think, when I think GE, I think like wind turbines and like, industrial things. And there's this kind of fascinating article in the New York Times recently. I don't know if people saw it, but essentially GE has this mission of becoming like a top 10 software company, right? And not just like an industrial conglomerate, right? And I don't know if the goals of 2020, but in general, like, why is GE doing this? How is open source intertwined in this kind of transition to kind of becoming a software company?
Chose like the easiest thing to talk about.
Hey, softball questions are always good to kick things off.
So a number of years ago, our CEO of CEOs, Jeff Immelt, kind of made this realization that heavy industry is moving kind of at the same pace it always has been over the last 50 years or so. When you think about GE from the turbine perspective, depending on the engineer you talk to, a turbine is a turbine is a turbine, whether it's for natural gas power generation, for wind generation, whatever. But not like consumer electronics, your phone, right?
Yeah.
Every 1 or 2 years, you get a new iPhone.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen for like heavy industry. So I asked the question at one point, how many turbines are there really on the planet? It's like, well, give or take about 13,000. Crap. Right, so I'm coming from the Apple iPhone perspective, where we've got 1 billion phones on the planet. That's awesome. But when you consider the difference, when Siri has a bad day, you're like, Walt Mossberg. Right? Oh, it could be awesome. But the flip side of that is for GE Digital and the Predix platform we're constructing, it's really about gaining significant insights for a lot of industry, whether it's power and water, transportation, aviation. So when you move the needle for heavy industry, you move the needle about 1% for folks like Southwest that use GE engines. The 1% increase in fuel savings is hundreds of millions of dollars annually. So when Jeff made this decree of we really have to become a strong software company, it becomes more about the metadata of the assets than the assets themselves.
Awesome.
And 2020 is not too far.
I know. We'll see how he measures up to that goal. But
in terms of sales, we have to eclipse over $1 billion,
okay.
$6 billion a year.
Yeah.
So
It's also, I think, in terms of the engineering talent too that you have to bring in. It's not just industrial engineers that are there. You have to kind of bring in typical. So
the buy, borrow, and build.
Yeah.
There's a lot of influence right now on open source because we don't have a whole lot of money, even though we're GE, and it takes a long time to get talent into GE.
Yeah.
We make refrigerators, life homes.
Cool. Awesome. So next question, Maggie. So Pivotal's an interesting company. Like, as an engineer, I obviously, like, when I think Pivotal Tracker. I don't know how many people remember kind of old school Pivotal days, but Pivotal has changed a lot since then. How is kind of since Pivotal's early days of kind of growing up, in that space, how has kind of open source been intertwined with Pivotal's story and to kind of where it is today with a lot of the investments it has in all the different open source technology out there, like Cloud Foundry and so on.
So early days, and we're about 4 years old now, so we're old. Yeah, so Pivotal's a really interesting organization in that, when we started, we came with assets from other organizations like EMC and VMware. And so, we had a kind of a head start on software at that time. And what that means for us today is that we're involved in a lot of different technologies and a lot of different open source projects that cross different technology boundaries, are parts of different governing models and different foundations. And so it's really an interesting and exciting place to work because you get to cross those boundaries on a regular basis. And for me and for my team, and I think for the company as a whole, there's a really big focus on the Cloud Foundry project, which is governed by the Cloud Foundry Foundation, of which Pivotal is a member of, part of contributing to the community on a regular basis. And Cloud Foundry is really about enabling this transformation, like Steve alluded to, where these non-software-based companies like or companies in banking and retail and other industries are becoming more and more aware that in order to thrive and continue in a economy like today's are trying to become more fluent with software development. And so that's the big focus from the Cloud Foundry perspective. And Pivotal is contributing back to that community, is a majority contributor to the project today. And then I'll briefly touch on some of the other the other open source projects that might be familiar, like Spring Framework and Spring Boot for simplifying the Java development.
I know, wow, that's a Spring fan. That's impressive.
It's wildly popular.
It is.
And then on the data side of things with Greenplum, which is a Postgres distribution, as well as our Hadoop distributions. So even if it's not what I'm doing on a regular basis, there's definitely work being done doing transformation in those spaces as well. Yep.
Well, thanks, Maggie. So Josh, we're at Siri, since fairly the early days, and pretty familiar with some of the open source lessons that happened at Apple during those days. But you decided to jump into EMC and basically open up EMC code and essentially what I would call like almost like a open source center of competency or open source office almost. So what motivated you to do that, and why is EMC actually doing this?
That's a really good question. It's funny. I think that Steve can attest to this. That surely when we built Siri, the most important thing was time to market. And so being able to move aggressively and being able to adapt very, very quickly to the things that we had to get out the door. Sometimes we couldn't rely on vendors for delivering features. We'd need a bug fix. They'd say, don't worry, it's coming out in the next release. Great, when is it? About 6 months. Just wait next quarter. Maybe it'll push. I don't actually know. And so what open source allowed us to do was, I think, two things. One was it kind of put the destiny in our own hands. We were able to fix bugs and push things and develop things very, very quickly. And the second thing was, and I'll be interested to see what you think about this is. When you build a system as big as Siri and you go from 0 to 160 million users, like with the flip of a switch, which is I remember how it happened. I don't know. Yeah, it was crazy. You need to be able to integrate a whole bunch of software together. Yep. And so for me, and I think the lessons looking back on it is that open source is really about its ability to integrate with other pieces of software. It isn't so much that it's cheaper. It isn't so much that it's free. I mean, we were at Apple. We had a pretty decent budget for the project. So it's not like we were picking open source software because it was the cheaper option. Yeah. It was that we had the ability to integrate it with all the other disparate systems more efficiently. And I think that's what drove our use of that.
Awesome.
Why I came to EMC.
Yeah.
That's people like you left Apple to go to EMC, and now you're at Dell.
Yeah. Valid question.
Yeah, it's a fun question. Look, one of the things that we did when we moved over from one architecture to the other was we moved everything over to containers, and we switched off of the virtual machine stack. And at the time, I think it was the largest containerized environment anywhere in the world, and I think it still is. But one of the challenges that you found with this was that it was very, very hard to run applications that required storage. It was very hard to run a container or a database in a container, because when you move the container, the data just sort of disappears. And we did some crazy things. We tried to write our own file system. We wrote a POSIX store on top of an object store. That was a terrible idea, Steve. I told you so. I know we had to try. We did some really, really crazy things. But the biggest issue was we hadn't solved how to run persistent applications in containers. And so when you want to solve that problem, you go to the biggest company in the world that did storage, and it was EMC. And so because of that, they gave me the opportunity to create code, and some of our biggest projects in the code community are around container orchestration for persistent applications with RexRay and libstorage and some of the other projects we're working on. So I feel like I got vindicated a little bit, that I was able to solve the problem, and that's really why I came.
Cool, awesome. Thanks, Josh. Conrad, so obviously you're super early at Uber, and I kind of could relate to the experience of being at a startup and being there early, where technology choices, are interesting, right? Like, you can't just generally use off-the-shelf things, especially if you're growing and scaling fast. And so my experience at Twitter, we used a smorgasbord of open source technology and stitched together to make it work for us. How was your experience at Uber in terms of, involving open source technology, why, and all that good stuff? So tell us some good battle stories.
Yeah, some battle stories. I got a few of those. Just thinking about my own personal experience, having worked in an academic setting and startups, a couple of 2 or 3 different startups. I've only actually ever really used, I think, commercial compilers once in grad school, and then once first year of engineering, and it was terrible. It was like Visual C++. Nobody knew how to use it, and we actually spent more time fighting with it. Yeah, I'm biased, of course, but so I think it's actually surprising when I talked to Josh after he invited me to come out to this about how there's still a lot of companies that go to those sort of off-the-shelf solutions to build products to create their business. In our experience at Uber is using Python and Node, and basically building a lot of our own stuff, but open source databases. We use MySQL. We switched to Postgres. I think they've switched back to MySQL now. All sorts of crazy stuff going on like that. Into our analytics infrastructure.
Yeah.
So when we started using Kafka, we eventually went to, I think we were going to go to Cassandra, but we did Vertica instead. So that was another commercial choice. But you can legitimately build a pretty serious business using just open source technologies in this day and age. Yeah. And I'm surprised that word hasn't gotten out.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. So, I love to kind of keep things informal. We'll eventually do some audience Q&A, but I'll ask a couple more questions. So, in a lot of cases, it's very common for companies just to consume open source, right? It's developers will naturally just use stuff that works and is easy. So I find that a lot of companies are just consuming stuff. They may not even know what they're consuming. The trickier part, what happens is kind of the reverse of that, is when you're a business and you want to open source or share something back. A lot of companies just throw something on GitHub and see what happens. So in terms of the production side of open source, is throwing code and open sourcing something just enough? Do you have any experiences that you'd like to share in terms of your respective backgrounds and companies that you've open sourced something and was it enough? Did you have to do something else? Kind of experience around that. Does anyone want to?
I'll take it for you.
Awesome.
Microphone working there?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think that at Dell, it's we went through a process of open sourcing one of our core products, and we open sourced it. We put about 1.5 million lines of code in the community. It was all Java, and I think we were surprised. I mean, I wasn't surprised, but some people were surprised that it didn't really get the uptake, or it didn't really get the adoption that you wanted, or that they wanted. It didn't really. Nobody if you drop what was the line I said the other day? If you drop 1.5 million lines of Java code on the community and something about a bear in the woods. I don't remember. But nobody notices, does it actually matter? Yeah. And I think another one of the reasons why I came to EMC is because at the highest levels in the company, people said, look, I get it. We don't know what we're doing. Tell us what we did wrong. Tell us how we can fix this.
Yeah.
And so now with code, when we open source something, we do it with a reason. We do it through a community. We do it with a purpose, and we do it with an intent. We don't just open source something, right? If you don't get the community support around it, if you don't drive people's attention to it or provide an area for people to talk about it, it doesn't matter. I think what that, like in a word, it's about consumption. If you open source something and nobody can consume it, who cares? Like if you put 1.5 million lines of Java out and nobody can build and compile it, like congratulations. And so that's some of the tenets I think code brings into an organization like Dell is we're going to either open source something and we're going to do it purposely, or we're going to make the decision that we're not going to open source it. We're not just doing it for the checkbox.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, Conrad.
So at Uber, a lot of our open sourcing that we sort of released, we had to clean up all our repositories because we were moving to a microservices architecture, and that was a really interesting transition for the company, like organizationally and technologically. But it was really interesting from the open source perspective because you would think about the components that you were building to put together these systems, and then you were trying to make them as simple and sort of general use case as possible, so that when they would eventually get open sourced, it wasn't like 1.5 million of code being dropped on somebody's head, right? Like it was like a small sort of well-contained component that they could potentially like use within their system. So yeah, we saw some of our stuff being used like that, but again, some of it was really, really specialized. So so it didn't get used.
I definitely think, sorry, go ahead, Maggie. Sorry, I'll summarize things, but go ahead.
I was just going to add, like, potentially from the contributor's perspective, like you said, it's like you don't want to just stumble upon a repository of code that you don't understand what it does or how to contribute back. So having a clear path to contribution is super important just from the contributor's side as well, not just what you're open source.
I think companies are definitely realizing that it's not enough just to like open source something and throw it over the wall and expect people to show up and start contributing. There's a couple times at Twitter where we open source some of our forks of Redis and just basically said, here it's available. Here's how we do caching. Why aren't people contributing back, right? So the whole thing was building a community is super important and making sure that the community is welcoming and actually going out and speaking about what you've done versus just chucking code over the proverbial fence.
You want to add to something?
Yeah.
Sure.
So one of the fun challenges about working at a larger company, say for instance GE or Apple, is they're really, really protective of their IP. So you might notice that Apple really hasn't released anything, and we really haven't contributed anything back.
Okay.
Heavy consumers, for sure,
yes.
right? Because things like, why would you want to build your own OpenSSL team? Because then it's like terrible to maintain. But as we were consumers of like Mesos and its framework, you really have to have a significant team on staff because it's sort of like a free puppy. Right? I mean, Puppies, but it's true, right? It's like, here, have this puppy. It's so cute, like whatever. But it takes some care and feeding, and you can't just like park it in the corner, like assume like it's going to be fine. So you have to have a reasonable staff that can really handle the care and feeding internally. But you also have to have the right partnerships externally, where if you do want to push code out, it has to be shepherded back into mainstream. Then you also have to have the strong internal relationships with folks like Marcom, the rest of your marketing team, your legal staff.
Absolutely.
Because they want to scrub everything possible so you're not leaking data out, right? And it's similar for GE. Most of our Predicts framework is open sourced. Some of the things we're doing around digital twin for advanced analytics, most of that's open sourced. And I think the bright side of this is within the last year or so, folks at GE have realized, our critical business information, our crown jewels, is really around the analytics we have from the deep expertise over the last 125 years or so of running heavy industry.
Awesome. So you mentioned OpenSSL, one of my favorite libraries. So are people familiar with OpenSSL? Like, SSL connections, very good, secure. So, interesting kind of hot topic around open source lately has been the notion of sustainability. How do you make sure to sustain projects that we all, potentially depend on? OpenSSL is definitely one of those. There's probably trillions of dollars of like financial transactions that you go to Amazon, you go buy some whatever for the house. You're touching OpenSSL code. What people didn't realize was there weren't too many people that actually worked on OpenSSL. So the funny story is like literally it's two guys named Steve, right, in Europe, and that's not one of the Steves. That literally maintain this critically important piece of infrastructure code that like basically the whole world depends on now. So my question the panelists is like how do you do as a business kind of deal with this open source sustainability problem, right? Because there's tons of code that you depend on within your company that you're aware of. How do you make sure that it's not just two guys, it's Steve in Europe somewhere that are working on critical infrastructure code for your business? Who wants to?
Why don't you start, Conrad?
I mean, I think the number one thing is package maintainers, right? Like basically, people upstream are committing all these changes, making all this stuff. We're not necessarily, except in very, very rare cases, which we did a few times at Uber, just like downloading the source, compiling it, and then like running it. So there's like a whole ecosystem involved there, which is like, the open source developers, the open source, whether it's Linux or other things, the sort of package management that are managing like how those changes get from, unstable to stable repositories. I think that's like a huge part of the story of being able to rely on that stuff.
I think what it comes down to is just awareness. Like, I think that if you went into the big banks or you went into some of these big companies, like, they don't know that OpenSSL is managed by Steve. Like, I think there has to be an awareness, and I think that if people begin to become aware over their dependencies on these core projects, it's important that they either come up with a different strategy or really learn to develop some in-house expertise in it. I think one of the biggest powers that open source brings to a company is like it's your own destiny. Like if you have enough people or not even enough people, if you have one or two people that can know a little bit about OpenSSL, then when there's a bug or when there's a problem or something like that, you can fix it. Yeah. Right? And you really, like, open source gives you that power. And I think that there's not enough companies that are aware, and then also not enough companies that are embracing the fact that, hey, we have all these dependencies, and we should hire somebody that knows a thing or two about this. There's another good joke about when we did some work for Siri in the later days around cryptography. And I know, right? We did some work around cryptography in the later days, and we wanted to get this particular project and this particular feature shipped, and it was a mess. And one of the challenges we got in a staff meeting one time is, well, you guys just downloaded some code from GitHub and want to ship it on 1 billion devices? Like, are you crazy? We're like, no. Like, we know what it is. We understand it. Here are 5 people in the company that understand what this is about. Like, you have to show some understanding. Like, blindly consuming software, blindly consuming anything is silly, right? Let alone something that you depend on for $1 trillion in transactions by 2 guys in, I don't know, are they in Russia? Or they're in
they're somewhere in Europe, somewhere like northern Europe.
So I think it's awareness, number one, and I think it's commitment. If you're going to do this, let's be diligent about it, and let's build some expertise in-house so that we can maintain it.
Yeah, the awareness thing is a challenge. Like with the OpenSSL case, there was this issue called Heartbleed that basically it was super bad for OpenSSL, and essentially anyone working like on the SRE side or DevOps had to patch like.
That was a terrible night.
Yeah. It was not a good day for anyone responsible for machines. So it's hard because generally you'd only get that awareness if you have such a like critical issue. But there's tons of other projects out there that I'm sure have other people named Steve that maintain it.
Maybe they're named Conrad or Maggie.
Maybe it could be Conrad or Maggie. Yeah, absolutely.
Spread the love a little bit.
Yeah. Conrad, do you have anything to say or no? Everyone? Okay. Cool. So sustainability is important. We have to make sure that, especially as businesses become so reliant on open source, we actually put and invest in making sure these communities and projects are healthy. Otherwise, it's to me it's like our roads. We pay taxes, so our roads are taken care of, right? It's like critical infrastructure that we all depend on. Another kind of question I'll bring up before kind of turning to the audience here is, To me, it's fascinating because I've been involved in open source for nearly 20 years, and if you kind of go back to that time, there was always like a funny joke that people who worked on open source kind of lived in their mother's basement or something, and just hacked on things, and like that's like complete. Well, maybe back in the day, maybe somewhat true, but like these days, like it's absolutely not true at all. Like open source is a professional thing. The majority of people that actually work on open source are employed to do so by their employer, and it's kind of amazing to see the transition that businesses have had over time. So I spent probably a good portion of my career building parts of the JVM and like the Eclipse technology because we were trying to build an open source alternative against what was known as kind of the evil empire back then, Microsoft, who maybe said some bad things about like
Did they just join your foundation?
They did.
Yeah,
they did. So they're good. They're good now. But like I still remember like Linux is a cancer, like open source is communism, and all these other things. But like things have changed over time, and now like I went to a recent like Microsoft event, and it's like Microsoft heart Linux and Microsoft heart open source. I'm like, what is going on? So, I think we're seeing, companies wake up that in order to actually be successful as a business and communicate with developers, you have to have some semblance of an open source strategy. And I think Microsoft has finally, realized this. What are your kind of thoughts and like other companies you have potentially seen kind of go through this, or your companies yourselves have seen this? I was going to poke you about Apple, but we'll
you can poke me. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, exactly. But feel free to whoever wants to go.
I mean, it seems to me there's like, there's two different companies that are big contributors to open source.
Yeah.
Like obviously the large companies, Yahoo, Google.
Yeah.
Uber's putting stuff out now.
Yeah.
Facebook, like LinkedIn. Actually, LinkedIn is like pretty awesome from a data infrastructure perspective.
We love Kafka.
What they put out there. But I think like smaller organizations, just like thinking from my experience at Uber, we didn't really focus on it that much. So I think there's probably smaller organizations out there that make it sort of part of their culture from the beginning. So that's how smaller companies will basically get into it. Uber didn't have it at the beginning, but once you get larger, it's just naturally something that you do because you've got a lot of people working on a lot of things, and you can potentially like leverage that, and you also used a lot of things, so you start feeling like giving back potentially.
Mic working yet?
Yeah, I think so.
I think that there are benefits. Yeah. I think this one's a little better. I think a lot of companies maybe are realizing that they can actually derive benefits from doing open source over doing proprietary. Like, I think there was a time when, having a proprietary technology was truly differentiating and you got to benefit from that. But I think, at least with our experience with Cloud Foundry, sometimes we do have a process that we start closed and then we'll evaluate whether it makes sense to go open with a technology. And we'll do that based on a couple different decision-making factors, like, is it being proprietary truly a differentiator? And when there are other, open source technologies that do the same thing, it's not truly a differentiator. Also, when you can leverage the community and when you can leverage community developers and governance models and things like that, engineering can go faster, and you can derive benefits from having an open source strategy like that.
So from GE Digital's perspective, since we're building the Predix platform, which is really, Harel Kadesh, our CTO, calls it an industrial operating system because it really spans from sensors on devices all the way up to like, advanced analytics in the cloud. One of the things, several strategies to get to being one of the top 10 software companies in the world is that in order to be agile, we're going to have to adopt open source code. And it's like the tagline, like you get what you give.
Yeah.
You can't just be a consumer of whatever. So like if you want to do deep application tracing, OpenTrace is kind of like a good format to do.
Yeah.
And Cloud Foundry supports Zipkin natively, but you're not going to have all the right plugins to do this crazy analytics for jet engines, right? It just doesn't exist. So that's one of the ways that GE Digital has been great about contributing back to open source, because when you genericize or kind of anonymize the code that we're doing. It protects our critical business information, but it also provides capabilities back to our customers, because Predix is really an open platform. It's good because then we can be agile and we can keep pushing out features, but it's also kind of self-deprecating in a way, because then any of our customers can come along and be like, hey, I'm going to do the same sort of competing object store. So they're allowed to do that, right? But I think it's definitely, open source is a philosophy you have to adopt these days. If you want to stay agile and you have a proper SDLC process internally, there really isn't a way you're going to get around not consuming open source in one fashion or another, aside from downloading some crypto library from some dude's GitHub.
Josh, you want to speak a little about Apple, open source, Swift?
Yeah, sure. So, people say, well, Apple doesn't give anything back. I think their official... That's
the rumor.
That's the rumor. I think that, and I'm not speaking officially for them, but I think that they would say, well, actually, we give back Swift and the compilers, and we give back all these developer tools. The web framework tool escapes me. I forgot what it was called. But I think they would say that they gave a lot back. But certainly, on the infrastructure side, I don't know that we did. We certainly didn't do it enough as we should have. And I think it's one of the reasons why people don't stick around there as much anymore. We weren't allowed to talk about it. We couldn't show it. We couldn't really communicate. And so while we were leveraging all this open source software, when we went out into the community to say, hey, we need help with blah, we say, well, where do you work? Well, we work at Eggcorn. What are you doing? I can't talk about it. And so what it does is, that kind of culture cripples your ability to leverage the community. It's really crippling. I think, on the other hand, if you look at the strategy that we've adopted at Dell, we want our products to be more consumable to more people. And open source is about making it consumable, making it easier to interoperate, making it easier to connect with other things. And so I think that you're starting to see, even in the world's largest IT company, this mindset begin to shift, so that if we don't adopt an open source strategy, if we don't develop our community, it's going to be harder for our customers, both in the enterprise, from the gaming side, from the consumer side, to consume what we're building. And I think that we're just really turning the corner on it, and it's a fun place to be right now.
No, absolutely. I think if you don't give back, you essentially end up with a fork internally, right? And it's just super expensive to maintain. And there's a saying in open source that contribution brings influence, right? If you don't actually contribute or build relationships with the communities you depend on, you can't expect them to, do what your business requires at all. They're just going to ignore you. So, fun. So we have about 15 minutes left or so. I'd love to kind of potentially get some questions from the audience before.
This guy right here. Don't take any questions from me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, just.
So is there anyone interested to kind of ask a question to all of us? It would be great to hear that. Do we have a mic? Yes, thank you.
Yes, I have a question here. You work at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, who's a part of the Linux Foundation.
Yes.
Up on stage here, we have several companies that are giving back to the community and their open source contributions.
Correct.
And we see this more and more, where projects are either joined into a foundation or sponsored by a corporation or an organization. Do you see a future of independent projects that are non-sponsored, like OpenSSL was before?
Yes.
Do you see a future for projects like that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think part of the challenge with open source, especially it's got more popular, a lot more companies get involved. There's been a trend over time to kind of build these foundations, right? To kind of allow companies to collaborate. And the reason this is done is a lot of large companies have, first, they compete. They may not trust each other. They have IP portfolios. And what foundations act as, essentially, is like a neutral ground for companies to basically sign a contract saying that here are the rules that we abide by and agree. We're not going to potentially sue each other. We're all going to collaborate on these things. You need some neutral playing field. And some of the older projects, like OpenSSL as an example, were really, developed in a time where like these foundations didn't really exist. There was just less companies involved. But now, like you look at Cloud Foundry, Cloud Native Computing, Open Container Initiative, the Node.js Foundation. These are all foundations that essentially have been built to allow multiple companies to kind of collaborate on an even playing field. So I think you'll see the trend continue. Some of the smaller projects may end up, in rolling up to a foundation just to get like enough corporate support. It's essentially just one way to like pull money in an independent way that you kind of go, contribute back and make sure these projects are being sustained. So hopefully that answers your question. Cool. Any other questions? Yes, there's a gentleman in the back.
He was on the list of no questions.
That's right. I have the
Teasing
mic.
you,
I
I'm
get to
teasing
talk.
Sure.
So open source has its roots in free software, right? So it was originally Richard Stallman, free as in freedom, not free as in beer.
Yep.
And so having been in this space a long time and having managed the relationship between a big company and the Free Software Foundation, it's been interesting to see over time that it's become much more pragmatic. So if you had a seesaw, it seems like open source, it's very community focused, but it's also very pragmatic. You're all talking about business advantages.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, A, how many of you have free software roots? And then B, are you getting any interaction with the free software community these days, or is it sort of kind of a much quieter and marginalized?
I could start off and answer this since I work at the Linux Foundation. So for people who don't know, there's like kind of a difference between free software and open source software. So free software has, definitely a set of, principles behind it, and it's mostly always to ensure that when you contribute to a free software project, under, what they would consider a free software license like the GPL, that code always it's always open, essentially, right? Whether you distribute or not, the code's always open. And on the open source side, you essentially have a philosophy of, you're free to use, remix, and do whatever, but you necessarily don't have to contribute back. And really that, I think, has become the more pragmatic thing. If you look at some of the data over time, the license popularity of things like under the Apache license, MIT has skyrocketed. Anything under like the Node community or infrastructure stuff tends just to be under a liberally licensed thing, and I think that's won out because there's less restrictions and legal things to kind of deal with versus what we would consider traditional free software. But the communities kind of work together, like the LF, right? We're kind of a diversified index fund of open source foundations, and like Linux, we support them. Linus is on staff. They're a great community, but we also have the Node community, and we have these other folks, and they sometimes do collaborate. There's really necessarily no tension between the communities outside of the open source side of the house tends to just be exploding. It's just like a different type of attitude towards things. So I don't know if that answers your question, but does it? Yeah.
You want free software?
Not directly, no.
Yep.
I mean, I'm a little too young, I think.
Can you say you contributed to Linux or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that, certainly like years and years ago, I think about, it was about free software.
Yep.
And then as you alluded to, the difference between free software has
Yep.
evolved to open source software.
Yep.
And I think that what was done was very pragmatic. People said, well, we're going to give you software for free, and you can literally do anything you want with it. And then I give you something for free, and then you go do something that I didn't intend for you to do with it, or I actually don't agree with, or whatever the case may be. And so I think what we've tried to do is find a balance in between that we want to give this to you, but we want to make sure that either your rights are protected or my rights are protected, or that everybody's kind of being much more pragmatic about it. So I think that there's been a shift away from free software, free as in beer, Richard Stallman, the cathedral and the bazaar, from decades ago,
Yep.
much more towards a more pragmatic approach. And maybe that's the distinction I make, is just because it's open source doesn't mean it's free,
Yeah.
right? It means that there are certain rules and certain guidelines and certain things that if you consume that software or contribute to that software, you have to agree to.
Yeah.
And I think that's a pragmatic approach. I don't know, Steve, you're older than me. So.
Yeah,
I just want to say, like, you don't have to be forced to contribute back based on the license.
Yeah,
like,
right.
it's painful enough to maintain an internal fork that it's in your best interest to contribute back. So
Yeah, so you're trying to date me, huh?
Yeah.
Like, put some delineation in our age
right.
difference. So I worked at a mid-frame computer company back in the mid-90s. Dude. But yeah, we were definitely, free software was definitely more of the free software thing. As we integrated some of the free, very early open source software packages into what ended up being like the Tandem nonstop operating system, we had like one guy in all of Cupertino was like really championing the idea and the concept of open source software, because you can't, without the proper care and feeding, you can't just adopt some free software and assume like you're not going to be an open contributor to giving back and helping grow whatever that project's going to be. And some of that carries on now for shops that don't openly commit back. So if you consume open source software and you privatize it, then you have to maintain like your fork over time. But yeah, in the mid-90s. So, I mean, free software is definitely its thing. And I think at the time we didn't really understand the risks of adopting really free software and making sure we had the right custodians of the code and people with the right domain knowledge to continue to maintain it.
Connor, you had something?
No, good. Cool. We got multiple questions now. Okay. Pick one. Yeah.
So you mentioned Heartbleed, and
Yes.
there's probably umpteen number of other ones you could create now.
Absolutely.
There's apparently been some recent disclosures of vulnerabilities in a wide array of softwares, both proprietary and open, that just came probably from some government location. And this is South by, so there's like multiple countries on stage here, and there's some government people that usually come out for this event. So how would you say government for various countries, including the United States, could be more contributory as opposed to predatory in how they approach open source?
So, yeah, no, I have a.
I don't know what that means.
So, Heartbleed as being an example. So when Heartbleed happened, the whole Too Steve things, oh my gosh, like governments depend on SSL also for, private communication, all that stuff. What the Linux Foundation ended up doing is we realized that SSL was just one project, that had this issue, but there's others. How do we actually get companies and other folks to kind of collaborate and like maybe build a fund to kind of help these things out? So what we ended up founding is essentially it's almost like a trust. It's called the Core Infrastructure Initiative. Almost no one knows about it, but the U.S. government, the U.K., Google, IBM, a bunch of companies fund this initiative, and essentially it's a group of people that decide which critical security-related open source projects need funding so they don't end up with the Too Steve, Heartbleed open SSL situation. So, what I would love to actually see is having, governments, fund more of these things, because essentially it's a tragedy of the commons type issue. It's a common good thing, and so governments to give back, they should. And part of the problem is we just didn't have structures in place for them to give back. And so with the CII as one example, there's also like Mozilla has like a Mozilla open source security something thing that's kind of similar. So having governments to give back financially to these things to kind of support them would be great. But I don't know if anyone has other opinions.
I mean, I think that there's been a debate about whether or not open source software is more secure. And while I don't know that we're going to get into that, I think that, like when Heartbleed came out, the beauty of it being open source was that there was, 15 or 16 different proposals for the fix, like the following hour. Where we struggled, at least at Apple, was all of our systems we could patch very, very quickly. I think we turned around 100,000 systems in 8 hours. Deploying that fix with open source software. Where we struggled was actually getting fixes from companies that release software in a closed format and then deploying that software. It took them a long time to give us a fix, and then it took us a long time to roll out that fix. And so I think that there is this benefit to software being open and making it more secure. If it's more secure, more people can look at it. And I think what you're finding is people say, well, there's security vulnerabilities in open source software all the time. Like, yeah, because there's millions of people looking at this, or there's 5 people looking at this that care. Whereas in the proprietary world, like, we don't find vulnerabilities until it's too late or until after something bad has really happened, and then the companies take a very, very long time to turn it around. So I think Heartbleed is actually a great example of how open source software worked well and how the process worked well. At least I think from my experience, where a load balancer vendor says, here's your update, and you're like, what's the process? Insert the USB key in the device, do this like Nintendo code button to like boot from the USB key. I'm like, great, I have 300 of these devices. Like, how long is that going to take me, right? And on the open source side of things, we just rolled it out very quickly.
Awesome.
There's an analogy there with, I think it was Wikipedia, when Encyclopedia Britannica published all the inaccuracies, and they were basically fixed right away.
Right.
Yeah. Many eyes make bugs shallow, I think is the Linus quote out there. Awesome. So we got about 5-10 minutes. Does anyone have any other questions? Yes, there's two people. Okay, go ahead.
Just had a quick one for actually Maggie. So in my opinion, well, actually before I worked for Josh, I worked on a team at then EMC where I was using Spring Boot. And in my opinion, Spring Boot is the just most transformational and awesome piece of software I've seen in the last 10 to 15 years. I was just so thrilled to get to work with it. And last year at OSCON, I spoke to some of the pivotal people about it. And if it's not Spring Boot, but maybe even just that model, what do you see that we could do with open source and maybe even in other languages now with Go and 1.8 and supporting runtime plugins to support that model? I see some equivalency with the unikernel, and I even I think suggested to some of your colleagues, hey, it'd be really cool if you could take a Spring Boot app and run it on unikernel, but just that all-in-one and taking the disparate technologies and provide that all-in-one, almost container-like at the application level. And I didn't know if you see that we can push that into other languages or is it just something unique because of the way Java works?
This is the right. As far as like an all-in-one experience, I think there is a lot of work being done from the peanut butter and jelly story of Spring Boot running on Cloud Foundry. So I think with that kind of environment, and you get a lot of those benefits with like build packs in Cloud Foundry, doing a lot of the auto configuration things that happen in Spring Boot and in Spring in general. And so, I'm personally kind of relatively new to Spring Boot myself, and so no. I think it's great. I think we have a conversation internally at Pivot all the time, like what part of this is Spring magic, and what part of this is happening on the Java side, or what part of this is happening from what the developer's doing. And so, I guess in my experience, there is that story that exists, like from the Spring to Cloud Foundry. I think I'm not sure if there's more work going on to bring that to other containerized platforms or not. I think in general with those things, it's like if there's a strong requirement and a strong ask for that type of thing, it'll be work that gets prioritized.
Cool. I think there's one more question, and then we'll start wrapping things up.
So I'm a developer. I'm not a lawyer. And one of the things that scares me to death about open source software is all of the maybe potential honeypots that I might come across as I start to code something in, maybe BusyBox or something like that, where I could open up my company to being sued. Is there an initiative? I know at the company I work for, you have different categories based on the license that they are, of A, B, C, whatever. Is in the Linux Foundation or any of the foundations an effort to get, or could there be an effort to make it where it's like you go to the movies, you have a G, a PG, and a rated R. So the non-lawyers that are developers can kind of do a quick assessment of risk here. to know that, hey, look, this has been certified by somebody, or is everybody too afraid to take a legal stand on some of these things?
No rated R code, non-rated. There's a couple facets to that problem. So like one is just like kind of the PG-13, like that's a standardized kind of scale. And for a long time in the industry, we didn't really have a standard way of kind of labeling license information in projects. And then with the Linux Foundation, we have this effort called SPDIX. Almost no one knows what it is, but SPDX.org essentially is a standard around actually standard metadata around software to ensure that it's machine readable and you can actually do some analysis, because licenses are done in a way where you can actually suck them down instead of trying to like grok the code and try to like auto detect it. It fixes that labeling problem. The second part of your question is, so like once you standardize that, the legal question of like what licenses are safe or whatnot, it's a company dependent question depending on your business strategy, right? Everyone's going to have a different level of risk that they're comfortable with, and also in terms of software, depending what their business is. Like if you're a company like Twitter or Uber, or Facebook, where like most of your software just runs on your server, you don't distribute much, there's a completely different risk portfolio in terms of what you could use internally versus if you're like a like a TiVo, Samsung, or whatever, like you actually distribute things on or distribute devices. It's a whole other different risk portfolio, and companies realize this and they have different strategies for them. But as part of that SPDX effort, there are all these companies working to kind of make this a little bit easier to do and standardize on, so that decision could actually be made. And we could talk offline, but there's other companies out there that are trying to make this a little bit easier too, and are trying to do commercial offerings, but I'd rather not waste that time. But people are working on it, but it's going to be a per business type thing depending on how you make money and all that stuff. So cool. We're just about done, but kind of ask one final question for our lovely panelists here. So open source has basically become pervasive. Like I said, it's like in your devices everywhere. And what I'm actually seeing is it's having an impact in other industries out there. So like I've read this crazy article that farmers now are kind of like sharing how they actually do farming and all this stuff, and kind of sharing the practices of how to optimize yield and all that stuff. And so it's just crazy to see like just random what I would consider random industries trying to find ways to share and better what they're doing, right? This is exactly what we do with software. So for the panelists, is there kind of any opinions of what the future industries do you think that like open source is going to revolutionize and change how we live?
Maybe not an industry.
Yep.
Technology. I'm interested to see if the smart contract philosophy, like over the blockchains, where that's going to go. And I think that'll be really, really interesting, because now you're writing legal contracts using code.
Yeah.
And there's going to be all sorts of weird cases where there's going to be bugs in legal contracts, which is, I guess that must happen now when lawyers aren't doing their job necessarily. So I think depending upon how those, how that blockchain technology is being used, maybe the mortgage market, maybe some other sorts of things, there's going to be an incredible, I think, move towards open source there, so people can be sure that smart contracts and stuff are like free from bugs.
I know.
I'll go since I have the mic, I guess. Moving from consumer to commercial and industrial, open source is definitely pervasive, and having that mindset. So speaking of like agriculture, so John Deere has a very significant connected network, and everybody else is following suit. So CAD is there, a bunch of other people. And for blockchain, so that's coming into play for contract verification as well as just authoring, because one of the things that happens is when contracts are renewed, not the entire document suite is renewed. So you'll have the primary documents renewed, and then a bunch of dependencies aren't. And usually those cover things like data access, export control, and whatever. So it's not inconceivable to be in a position where you will be suddenly federally incompliant with data access patterns and who can see what at the flip of a switch, because somebody didn't do their job and actually follow suit with everything. So definitely industry-wise, it's definitely pervasive, and that's part of what Jeff Himmel's like. Yeah, let's do this all for once for everybody, and it's really difficult.
Yeah.
Just one quick thing about that. So, because GE does things like power generating natural gas turbines,
Yeah.
everybody has them, and we sell them to countries that necessarily hate each other. And we're asking, yeah, let's put it online so we can get instrumentation metrics and where you could previously have your nation states guard their power generation facilities with like real people and armies and air forces. Now, as they become online and everybody is more or less digitized, the threat vectors multiply exponentially at that point.
Absolutely.
So now they're not just looking at ways to infiltrate each other that way, but they're looking at flaws in GE assets and whatever. So one of the things about verifying code sanity, what we tolerate is very, very, very small, if anything.
No, it's somewhat terrifying because I was sad when my little Nest thermostat went down for a little bit, but that's not something that I depend on my life. So it's going to be interesting. Security is going to be a very important thing as we move to IoT and connected world. So, anyone else to wrap things up?
As far as
Future.
a future industry going to be impacted by open source, and maybe because I'm a Texan, I'm biased in this way, but I feel like there is a lot of potential for that in the oil and gas industry, or in the energy industry as a whole, where not necessarily considered a highly technical industry in the past, but there's a lot of potential for companies in the oil and gas to collaborate right now, especially when going through hardship. There's a tendency to band together, collaborate, share information, share expertise, and share development work. So I guess I'm hopeful that's an industry that could be impacted.
Yeah, it's definitely already happening too. So Open Earth Community, awesome website.
Can I get my last thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, selfishly, I know Jonas knows what I'm going to say. I think drones are super exciting. I know those of you that know me are laughing, but I'm serious. I mean, I think if you go back a decade and you look at what drones have done for revolutionizing the U.S. military, it's done a lot. It's saved a lot of lives.
Yep.
And what we see now and why it's so popular is because this technology has become open source. Yep. And so because it's come open source, it's come down market, it's become cheaper, it's become more accessible to more people. And so I think that's why you see, UPS launching drones and Amazon wanting to do package delivery and people running drone races. And I think, where it affects an industry is, we have a customer who was a roofing inspector, commercial building inspection, and he had developed some software that does building analytics. And he had fallen off enough roofs and hurt himself enough times that it was very difficult for him to get contractor's insurance or liability insurance and medical insurance for himself. And so he's looking at being in a business for 20 years and not having the ability to continue moving forward. And, we talked a little bit, and now he's actually using drones to do roofing inspections and do his job. And so from a business perspective, his liability insurance is substantially lower. He's not climbing on top of power reactors anymore. Yep. He's not falling off of buildings. And so because his costs are lower and because his time is much, much more efficient, he's actually able to do more work and do more things that even other companies couldn't do for the same price because his prices are so much lower. And I think that I know it sounds silly. I know you guys are laughing at me about drones, but this is happening. And I think a lot of it has to do with open source.
Awesome. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Conrad. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Steve, Josh. Hopefully, everyone kind of learned a little bit more of how open source is changing things in the industry and also future industries. So up next, I think I'm going to introduce Jonas, but there'll be some breakout sessions where if you want to talk to any of us, please do so. Our Twitter handles are up there. Feel free to tweet away. Nothing but compliments and questions. So again, thank you, everyone, for your time, and thank you, panelists, for taking the time.
I love it out here. This is my element. We have a lot lot of people who are passionate about being outside and staying outside longer, and so the gear that they make is really around doing that. I mean, I think it's part of the culture. That's how this company started, so we get outside often.
That's what it's really about. Staying warm, staying protected, keeping dry, and enjoying. And that's, I think, really what we try to achieve. We wouldn't be able to do it without some of the advanced technology that we have. The software allows us to visually see where the measurements are in relation to how a garment is going to be draped over body. We gain a tremendous amount of speed and accuracy by having 3D prototyping. In the past, we've brought in a prototype and a designer starts to design the garment on the prototype. Now we have the ability to actually start the design work on an avatar, so the designer can move the pockets up or down, left or right, in a matter of seconds.
Our relationship with Dell Technologies opens up opportunities for us to do more and more with our product.
Yeah, it looks really good.
Here it is.
Oh, look at that. That is awesome.
We're able to really test it right here in our backyard, and we're able to provide feedback directly when people are wearing it to our teams. And it's only because we push ourselves through the utilization of technology that we're able to get to where we are. Whoa!
My name's Rakia Reynolds, and I am the president and founder of Sky Blue Media. On any given day, I'm working with fashion, lifestyle, technology, and nonprofit clients, and my XPS 13 allows me to stay 3 steps ahead of the game. It's stylish, I love the touch screen, and I can go an entire day without having to plug in. I manage the chaos and success of my life with my XPS 13.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Dell Experience. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm Sarah Luden.
Hi, Adil